All right, it's 7 o'clock in Alaska, and this is Free the People, and tonight we're planning to hear about some issues around status, standing, and agency from our friend Patrick the Michiganian.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was a Michigander, but that's one thing you corrected about my English, so we're looking forward to hearing, getting a few more things corrected. But we've talked, oh, sorry, I'm getting an echo here. Patrick and I have talked before just on a private call, and I've published those conversations about status and standing on TalkShoe under the Foundations channel. There's just about 10 different recordings there, and so you can find 2 different recordings with Patrick and his dad and I just going through some status and standing issues. So before the recording started and before everybody came in, I suggested that Patrick might just give us a rundown about how he got started, kind of where he's coming from as far as perspective goes, and then just speak about what's on your heart. And then we'll take questions if you'll write your questions down so that you remember them. We'll take questions after 20 minutes or so, or whenever a natural break happens. If that works?
Yep.
Okay. Patrick, tell us about how you got involved in all of this. Fine.
So I would say, probably like a lot of people, my first eye-opening experience was kind of, I guess, reflected on the whole 9/11 incident with the attacks in New York and all that. It started, that was kind of the first event that started making you question a little bit about what's going on in this reality in our world and how things like that could even take place. So it was shortly after that I think my dad started bringing home information from people that he worked with, and one of the first things I watched was Aaron Russo's Freedom to Fascism, dealing with taxes and IRS and a lot of the corruption and stuff within government. At which pace I read like Cracking the Code, and some other books, and just really piqued my interest. And this is probably 10 to 12 years ago now, when I first started just kind of testing the waters to see what else was going on in the world that coming out of high school and stuff you're just completely unaware of. You have no point of reference to some of these other things that are taking place in the world. So, that initiated me into trying to learn and see the world from a bigger perspective. And along the way, I've followed and studied a lot of different groups and people. Winston Trout, Roger Elvick stuff, Hartford Van Dyke, Kenneth Scott with Gemstone was one where I had a lot of good research. Gene Keating, there's Ted Turner. There's been a lot of names in the field. And just over time, you start to see a much different perspective, because the more people and groups you follow, it just starts to give you a fuller picture, because every individual and every group kind of has their own limitation of what they kind of work through or comprehend and kind of piece together, this big puzzle, which ultimately led me to kind of stepping back the furthest I could find, which was international law and the law of nations. This seemed to me the biggest thing that a lot of people were missing in these different groups and these different studies that they were doing. And it seemed important to me to try to look into it a little deeper after coming across certain information in certain court cases, and reading case law that started to, see terms pop up and talking about international law and legal states of the individuals, political status, civil status, domicile, nationality. You have all these different kind of legal mechanisms going on in the background that, again, we're mostly oblivious to because they're nowhere in our education system. So when I got to international law, it was just kind of trying to find the right material that was applicable to our situation currently, because going into the field of international law, you realize that countries are really situated quite differently. In America in particular, our form of government was different than anybody else in the world. It still is to this day, from my understanding. So it's hard to find proper material that was easy to digest. So it takes a lot of time to kind of just build your vocabulary up. So, it's just a matter of reading material and trying to look for understanding. I see a lot of people jump into the research always looking to cast judgment and always looking to invalidate. certain concepts or ideals that they're really more complex than what most people realize. But because they live in such an isolated view or in their box, you can't quite see the bigger picture. And that to me is what international laws kind of provide. Is it gives you that widest perspective you can see the world from, and try to understand how these different legal jurisdictions work together in a sense, but yet they're still distinctly their own. And there's certain procedures set forth in how the courts are instructed or are mandated, and what laws apply to which individuals in which situations. And so there's almost like these gateways or these yes/no questions that kind of have to be gone through right at the beginning of any court case, to establish jurisdiction, to establish law form, to establish the legal capacity of the parties that are in the dispute. And it's kind of those universal principles that kind of are the underpinnings, the framework or the structure of all the legal systems in the world. And so it's really just trying to find, a lot of my research has been focused on what are the common denominators, or what are the universal principles at play, kind of like when someone wants to go and study natural laws, whether it be, physics or chemistry or ecosystems. Like, there's these fundamental principles that everything kind of hinges upon. And from my understanding, international law is a lot, in the same way, that there's there's fundamental principles that everything relies on, so that we have order out of chaos. And a lot of people see that as, this is a control mechanism that's used to enslave people. And in a lot of instances, it can be used that way. But it doesn't mean that that's inherent in what it is. Law and money and these systems, from my perception, are just tools. And tools can be used for good and bad. So it's really, that's where the individual comes in, and how we interact with these systems. We really steer which direction our civilization, where our society goes and where our culture goes, pending the choices and decisions that individuals make, through their everyday lives. So the education and understanding of these concepts is really kind of a fundamental pillar to have, a just society that's built on peace and, cooperation, while still being competitive. And it's kind of this weird contradiction between, being competitive but yet cooperating, because we're operating on the same level. It's kind of a good analogy would be sports. All the teams are competing, but they're all playing by the same rules. And it's that system, that order of those rules that make the sport work. That's what makes it, people achieve greatness, right? Because it pushes people to fine-tune their skill sets and stuff to a level that they wouldn't be able to do without that competition. So our economies and our markets can work a lot the same way, where it's destructive, but it's also creative. And it's that interplay between the two that can really create a very good life, or a high quality life for a lot of people. So I don't know if I'm just kind of rambling now, or if you guys are on the same page with a lot of what I'm saying, but do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I tried to come in and I went to the sub-conference. So, yeah, I do have some questions, and that is, where did your study of international law start? Did you start by reading Law of Nations, or?
I perused a little bit of Law of Nations from Emmerich Vital, which kind of leads into the understanding that the Law of Nations was a set of principles that was pretty well recognized for quite a long time. I mean, I think you even see the outlines of it in the Bible, in a lot of the, the ancient texts and stuff like that. Emmerich Vital was probably one of the first that put it into a, almost like a treatise, like a unified book, a single source for people to go to and read. And so I've read a little bit, but I've never read all of it. I try not to get too much in the details, because I'm trying to just get the bigger picture, or how these things interact, the general principles at play. I wouldn't consider myself any sort of expert or into all the little details and every nook and cranny of it, because it's kind of vast, and it would take too much time. But so I first read into just Law of Nations and understanding some of those basic principles of how these different legal jurisdictions interact, which led to the finding of private international law, which wasn't actually created until the 1860s. So we have the Law of Nations being written in the 1750s, just previous to the creation of the United States of America, and then in the 1860s we have this big shift again with trying to figure out how these legal systems are going to interact, because people started to travel at a much higher rate. And the business and commerce that was taking place was happening at a much higher rate that it was creating problems within the application of laws. So kind of in the international community of all these nation states, they had to come together and find some sort of systemic order that would make proper application of these different legal jurisdictions and laws possible. Because when people started traveling in all these different places, it made it very difficult. So we have to account for some of those changes that took place in the 1860s and understand the effects that then has on the internal laws of our nations and how these different legal jurisdictions are then determined. And that's what you find from some of the court cases kind of lead into it. But the biggest source that I've had for learning international law would be Francis Wharton's treatise, because it was written specifically for the private international law in America. As I kind of mentioned earlier, we are set up with essentially like a concept of dual federalism, split sovereignty, and then we also have the 14th Amendment, which creates another little nuance within our structure of government with the United States. But Francis Wharton's treatise was really geared towards how to properly administer the laws in the United States of America, since all the nation states are essentially independent nation states, right, with their own constitutions and laws, right? So we have a public and the private side, and it's really between which side of the law you're on, that changes the definition of what the United States is and what the jurisdiction is. Because under public international law, they have political jurisdiction, and politically we're unified, we're one entity. But when you go to private international law, you're talking about a nation's territorial jurisdiction in contrast to their political jurisdiction. And so when you get into a nation's territorial jurisdiction, all the nation states are independent and foreign to each other. So this is where you get that kind of another layer, because of the federation, because of the union that was created. In some instances it's one entity, in other instances they're all foreign. And this is where we get into trying to decide, well, which laws apply when and how, and especially when you're looking at taxing jurisdiction.
Okay, so make it simple for us. Yeah, but no, that's what we need to understand, is how it all fits together. So, yeah, if that's what you're prepared to talk about tonight, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, well, and so it doesn't have to get too complicated to the individual, because mostly the public side of it is only applicable to, political entities, governments, their agents, their instrumentalities, anyone that's fulfilling a political duty of being in like a public office, that they're regulated under, these public bylaws of how nation states are to interact, diplomats and whatnot, when they're signing treaties. These are all under their political capacities. 90% of what we're going to be under is private international law, because this is what it affects individuals and private entities, your private companies, even your partnerships and stuff like that, private corporations. They're under private international law. They're not operating in a public capacity. And so part of what's helped separate some of these things is because corporations don't have political rights. Obviously they're private entities. Sometimes they're funded through public monies and stuff, and they're attached to government, but they're not fulfilling a political duty. So the governments, a lot of people talk about governments just being corporations, and that is true, but it's only half the truth, because governments operate in both public and private sides. So in one capacity, they're operating under a lawful capacity to represent their people and their political rights, but they also have the capacity to operate as a corporation, right? They can get into business contracts, they own property, and they do those things in the private side too. People are much in the same way, where we operate in both public and private. And the reason I kind of bring this up is because there's a court case, United States versus Wong Kim Ark from 1898, which states it pretty clear that every individual in the civilized world is granted upon birth 2 distinct legal states. And we operate in both these capacities. And I think that's other people fall victim to trying to oversimplify these systems, when it just takes a little bit different perspective. It's not that it's more complicated. It's just that there's more logic or reasoning behind how we have to organize our systems of law. So in Wong Kim Ark, it states, let's see, I'm trying to find it here a second. So you have every individual is granted two legal states. One's the political status and one is the civil status. Now your political status is in relation to your nationality, and that has to do with your political allegiance to the nation that you were born under. And part of the political allegiance is that you know, to not war with your nation state, right? You can't adhere to its enemies, you know, in times of war and stuff like that. But really that's about it. You have a right to representation. You know, that's a political right to vote, to hold public office. And so the rights and capacities under the political status are, it's not that they're not important, but they're not that diverse. There's not a lot there. It's when you get to the civil status that we find the majority of our rights, because the civil status is what is tied to your domicile. And this is where we've gone through some changes since the 1860s when they had to acknowledge the supremacy of the law of domicile as a determining factor for any conflict of laws disputes. So this is what happens when individuals traveling through different jurisdictions. They use the civil status, the place that he's domiciled at, as a determining factor of what law form he's under. So that civil status is really important, because all your personal, all your civil rights, right? Everyone's talking about civil rights. Well, civil rights are your private rights, or your property rights. So it's your ability to, you know, contract. It's your ability to marry. It's your ability to write wills and testaments and stuff like that. It's essentially defined in your legal capacity in relation to other entities, you know, in the world at large. So the civil status is governed by that domicile, which previous to the 1930s, from my understanding, was essentially a physical presence test. So wherever you were, you know, you spent the majority of your time, wherever you had your permanent residence, was your domicile, and the courts would have to go through that process of determining where your domicile was to establish jurisdiction. If they had jurisdiction, if they didn't have jurisdiction, and so if they did, then what law form are you under? You're under the laws of New York, you're under the laws of Florida, are you under the laws of New Mexico? Because every state, again, in this capacity, are separate and distinct to themselves. What appears to have happened in the 1930s is they, instead of using physical presence, they said, hey, we've got business happening, we got all this interstate travel going on now, right? Automobiles are coming online, trade's picking up, you know, the Industrial Revolution, all that stuff's going on. So it would appear, they said, we're going to do like the birth certificate, right? We're going to make it a government record, and we're going to have people register their legal domicile, so we don't have to go through this test, this physical presence test. And it is my belief that that's part of what was behind the change in currency in '33, and then the Social Security Act, or the Securities and Exchange Act in 1934, and then they had the Social Security Act of 1935. And so the Social Security Act, to me, is that numinate record. That's your financial account that's tied to every piece of business that you do, right? Anytime you sign any sort of contract or agreement, everyone wants that Social Security number. And they use the Social Security number to determine what your tax status is, too. And that's where a lot of people go in there and check U.S. citizen, not realizing that, again, they're talking about U.S. citizen and citizenship under private international law, not public. So the United States under private international law is composed of just the territorial jurisdiction of the United States, which is District of Columbia and other federal territories. It doesn't include the states. So this is from my understanding of breaking down these definitions, and what's happening is that, you know, 95% of the people in America should have been and should now be filing those forms as a legal alien, because territorially we are alien to the United States' exclusive jurisdiction. You know, they're foreign to us in that capacity, because essentially if I'm in Michigan under private international law, anytime I do anything outside of Michigan, that entity I'm foreign to it, I'm alien to it. Because there's only two statuses an individual can have in relation to a government. You're either a citizen or you're an alien. So that's it. Those are the two choices. Now, if you're under public international law, you'd be a lawful alien. If you're under private international law, you'd be a legal alien. I know I'm probably dropping a lot on you right now, so I don't know where you're at, if you probably want to ask some questions.
I think we'll stop and open the floor for a couple of questions, but keep them a little bit. Make sure you keep them right on this topic, and then we'll move on a little bit.
Yep.
And I was talking about the questioners. Are there any questions right now? Okay. Chris is asking, so when you talk about an illegal alien, does that pertain to what we're talking about here?
Yes. Well, illegal alien would be, so under public international law, you have foreign nationals. So like someone who's coming from Mexico is a foreign national, or someone coming from Canada would be a foreign national. And they could be an illegal or legal alien, right? And this all has to do with how they come into the country. And part of the reason they go through and you have the processing is because, again, these letter records usually determine law form and taxing jurisdictions and stuff. So it's really important that these things are followed, because without it, we can't administer our laws properly. So an illegal alien is somebody, that has come into the territory without proper, paperwork or proper processing, to where they're in the system, right? They've been incorporated into the administrative side of the state, so that they know who they're dealing with. Essentially, an illegal alien coming in is like a virus, kind of coming in. It's unregistered, it's undocumented, so we don't know who they are or what they're doing, and it makes it hard for us to properly apply the laws, because now what if this person creates an injury or damages something and they get hauled into court, but we have no record, so that's kind of, where this kind of comes in, is just, again, trying to properly apply the law form that is applicable in any given situation.
Okay, so you're talking about, just to reiterate a little bit, under private international law, that's where we find most of our rights, and that's based on the law of domicile. So it's basically where you're claiming your home is. Is that
correct?
Right?
Yep, your permanent residence. And it's a particular, because this is the other important concept, is that even if a man had no nationality, if he was stateless, or he had more than one nationality, it really becomes irrelevant, because everything goes by the domicile. And this is why every man, regardless of his political status, has to have a domicile, and you can only have one. You could have 15 different residences, but you can only have one domicile. And this is wise, because that is the test for which laws apply, which jurisdiction. It works as like a connecting factor to a legal jurisdiction.
So how is it determined? How's your domicile determined? You determine it, is that right?
It's historically has always been by the free movement of people, right? Everyone was allowed to expatriate, naturalize, and move kind of throughout the world, and wherever you chose to stop, wherever you chose to put your roots down, you could claim that was your permanent residence, right? But that's where my study comes in, where they detached the physical side of domicile and made it a legal concept, and they made it a government record. Because this is why we see a drastic change in the laws following the 1930s. And it's because they had all these citizens that used to have state domiciles. Now were classified as U.S. citizens, so they had a federal domicile, which put them under the jurisdiction of Congress, and it alienated from their state government.
And what was was it the Federal Reserve Act and the Securities and Exchange Act and the Social Security Act that did that, or what were you saying was the next?
It went all together, kind of hand and foot, because once they changed the currency, they stopped printing United States notes, and they started only printing legal tender Federal Reserve notes. Those Federal Reserve notes were actually underwritten by the property and the labor of U.S. citizens. This is where they introduced bondage and usury into our country, and this comes from the international banking cartel that's been doing this for centuries to different countries, for a very long time. So they introduced that, and they essentially brought human bondage in. So that our currency became, instead of being asset-backed, redeemable money that was either backed by gold or silver or some other commodity, it became backed by human labor and by the property of the U.S. citizens. So this is where it's important to understand the difference of citizenship, because that's what's going to determine whether they have a right to claim your property and to separate you from your property, or whether you have private property rights. Because the federal government operates as a collectivist government. There is socialist democracy. And you can go, there's a Senate document, I think it's Senate document 43 from 1934, which, I mean, just point blank says all property ownership resides in the state. The state they're talking about is not the states of the Union, it's the United States. It became its own with the 14th Amendment came online, when they passed that legislation, they created a new class of citizen. And that's what created the political body of the United States. And that is distinct and separate from somebody having the citizenship in a state. So there's these few key elements, or these events that took place that really altered. And it was because of the infiltration. These people, they came in, they infiltrated, and they perverted our systems because they wanted to enslave people. So it's really just a matter of deconstructing the events that they did to initiate their plans. We need to peel it back and understand those legal mechanisms so that we can turn this back into our favor, because our fundamental law is still there and it's still in full effect, and we have a full right to access these things in you know, the common law of the states, the private property, the unalienable natural rights. These all still exist, but they're all hinging upon the civil status of the individual. So that's where, again, all the power still resides with the individual, but we have forgotten, or we have not studied these things, so we don't understand what's happening. And when we understand what's happening, the mechanisms at play, then we need to deconstruct it and get back to those fundamental records and make sure that they match the reality, right? That they match our intentions and our will, because that's our free will, that's our choice. And we're still guaranteed that because of our fundamental documents, because of our constitutions.
Okay, we're right with you. So give us your where you're at as far as deconstructing and how to set the record straight.
So my initial goal was just to resubmit. You follow the directions through Social Security to change your citizenship, which would be just to file another SS5 with the information that you want on your record. Which, upon submitting, they of course denied to process the request. Again, operating as a gatekeeper and not allowing people. So a lot of people want to talk about the criminality in the system, and it's not that they're not correct. There's definitely corruption and criminality there, but it's our job to find where the criminal element exists, or what is the actual action that is criminal, that we can go prove it in court. And we need the evidence. We need to be able to go through there and lay this case out, which is essentially where I'm at with it, because they denied to process the request on the belief, or on their opinion that, well, you're born in Michigan, so you have to be a U.S. citizen. So this is the interface where they're taking an individual's nationality and forcing him to have a civil status, a private civil status that matches the nationality. When you get into studying federated countries and international law, you'll find that it point blank says anytime you're in a federated country that has separate legal jurisdictions, your nationality and your civil status, your legal domicile, they're going to be different. They're always going to be different. The only time that they would not be different, where the nationality and civil status, your political status and civil status would be the same, is if you're actually living in D.C. or you're living on a federal enclave within a state. Like, you have to have residence on federal territory. So they're not allowing now the system is the people that, well, I don't know if others have tried it. I think my dad actually found one case where a guy was doing the same thing and tried suing, on the same elements that they were denying him to correct his record through Social Security. So they didn't allow me they didn't process the request. I sued him in district court, in which went through the whole process. It took like 5 months to get through the whole thing, 6 months, which ended with them I had to rebut a lot of their assumptions up. The magistrate had a certain ruling I had to come back with. The judge saw it and dismissed it based on the fact that there was no comprehensible remedy, and they said that my case was frivolous. From my understanding and perception, we're at the point now where the people within the system are ignorant and incompetent to a lot of these things as well. So we're because this has gone on for so long, we're going back, to the 1930s, and here we are, it's 2020. We have a lot of re-education essentially to do, and we're going to have people that are able to lay this out and get the right questions in front of the people that have an obligation to answer them, so that we can figure this out, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this is exactly what's going on and this is the mechanism they're using. And that's where I know you guys were talking about studying the remonstrance process that I know the E-Clause people are doing, Chris Hallett and them. Maybe some of those things come into play where you start asking these, these hard-hitting questions, but getting to the fundamental core issues, because a lot of people want to argue the driver's license, the voting, all these different elements, but they really they come after it, right? They're not the fundamental issue. They're not the source of the problem. And all my research is based on trying to get to what is the source of it and how do we correct it at that level. And my understanding would be that's the SS5.
When you submitted the SS5, and this is where we ended our previous discussions, with you were working on getting your citizenship changed. But what was that process? What were you trying to do? You were changing from a U.S. citizen to what?
To a legal alien allowed to work. Because you're looking at, again, everyone that's entitled to, this is again where you can kind of see the changeover from public to private. When you look at who's entitled to receive a Social Security account number, it says you're either a U.S. citizen or a permanent lawful alien. Now, permanent lawful alien is, again, you're talking about nationalities, and this is under public international law. So if you've come into this country and you're claiming a permanent residence, then you're entitled to receive a number as well, because you need a number for commerce. You need a number to be able to interface with all these public institutions. And if that number is the underpinnings of your civil status, this is what determines your personal law. This is again why everyone has to have one. This is part of those everyone having two distinct legal states. That's the second one, right? You have the political status, then you have your civil status. So everyone's entitled to it if you're a U.S. citizen or a permanent lawful alien. And now when you go to citizenship question number 5 on that application, it clearly says, well, legal alien. Well, they just jumped from lawful to legal. And this is where they went from public to private. Citizenship is one of those things that, again, it has two different meanings depending on which body of law you're under. Because if you talk about citizenship under public international law, then we're talking about nationalities. If you talk about citizenship under private international law, we're talking about the domicile, because it's territorial, not political. So there's those two main layers that exist as a fundamental underpinning of all these different legal jurisdictions. All the courts, across the world they're part of civilized society, right? If they have, if they interact through commercial means and international treaties, then they all use these same systems. So it really affects everybody. So my process was correcting not my political status and nationality, because that's not the source of the problem. The loss of the civil rights that we're experiencing, the loss of ability to own property, is a result of the civil status being a U.S. citizen. And in the private capacity, that is saying that I have a legal domicile on federal territory. So this is how they're getting around the Constitution, because technically they have not violated the Constitution. Congress granted exclusive rulemaking powers to administrate property of the United States and United States territory. So by changing the status of the person and putting the person, domiciling the person on their territory under their exclusive jurisdiction, this is how they've just exponentially expanded their jurisdiction that they wouldn't have had without that happening.
Well, at some point, and I think it was the Civil War, that the individual states stopped being individual nation states because they no longer had the ability to leave. They couldn't secede.
Yeah, technically they could have seceded, but they would have had to go through a constitutional convention and had a vote on it. That was part of what was the problem with the southern states, when they just said, oh, we're just going to leave. Well, they pledged a perpetual union. You can't go into a perpetual union and just change your mind. Like, you have to follow procedure. And what they did, essentially the Civil War was instigated by these international bankers to create it's a divide and conquer mechanism again. So and maybe that wasn't the point, but the point, there was a place, and maybe it was through the 30s in the acts of Congress that you are talking about, but there was some point where the individual states they stopped seeing themselves as individual countries and individual nations,
And so whenever you bring that issue up that, I'm a state national, my political status is that of state national. Now, tell me where I'm at if I'm talking about 8 USC 1101, A21, and that's one owning allegiance to a state. Are we talking about, that's nationality?
Yep. That's nationality, and you're under public international law for that. And that's where, again, if under public international law, the country is the United States of America. It's one entity. Now, that one entity is comprised of at least, we're just going to say on the safe side, 51 nation states, right? We have the 50 states of the Union. We have the United States, which is the District of Columbia. So
I don't know if that qualifies as a nation state, but... Yeah, that's essentially what a lot of people overlook. I would recommend, I don't know if I sent it to you, it's the dissenting opinion from Downs v. Bidwell in 1901. It's Justice Harlan. And they talk about and how they were able to start writing legislation outside the limitations of the Constitution because they were their own nation state, essentially, and they should have all the powers that were exercised by nation states of the world at large, right, historically. Nation states have the sovereignty or the ability to write, to manage their internal affairs however they see fit. So this is where they create a split within the federal government, where in one capacity they have limitations on their powers in relation to their federal capacities, the delegated powers. In another capacity, when they're writing legislation for U.S. citizens, which are not connected to the Union, which are not a part of the state, they can write whatever legislation they want. And it's not a violation of the Constitution because they're their own entity. They have their own territory, they have their own organized government, and with the 14th Amendment, they have their own citizens, which entails they have their own body politic. So that's where it gets a little tricky. When you're seeing public acts from the United States Congress, well, if they're out writing legislation in a private capacity, those public acts don't apply to the Union. Those public acts only apply to U.S. citizens and on federal territory. That's a different public. Right. Just like if you're in Michigan, Michigan has public laws, and they only apply within the territory of Michigan. Michigan's public laws don't have any force in Illinois or, Kentucky. So that's where there is still a distinct separation there, and I would tell you that they are still independent nations, and they're still recognized as that because when you set up a corporation, I can set up a corporation under the laws of Michigan. If I take this Michigan corporation, I want to do business in Illinois, I have to register with the Secretary of State or some office of that nature that I want to do business in Illinois, and I have to register as a foreign corporation. Because it's a foreign territory. Each state has its own constitution.
Yep.
That's primary.
And all the state constitutions start with "We the people of" whichever state. And this is where you get you have to learn the understanding of our actual structure of government again. And like a lot of these things aren't taught to us, so we're really been behind the 8 ball with trying to piece this together without having nearly enough information. Because you have the 9th and 10th Amendments, which talks about whatever powers are not delegated to the federal government are reserved for the states or the people. So then you go, okay, so we got 18 or so enumerated powers to the federal government. Everything else is with the state. So then you have to go to the state constitution. The state constitution is the same thing. The people of the state delegated a certain amount of powers to the state government. They said, okay, on the Constitution you can do this, this, and this. Whatever's not in this Constitution is reserved with the people. This is why the people were still considered sovereign, only in the capacity of whatever powers they did not delegate away, right? And so that's where it's essentially we had this split sovereignty where the individual maintained some of their powers, but they gave some of them to the state, and then the state turned around and said, well, hey, if we all work together and work cohesively as a union, then we can give some of the powers to this national entity, and it'll be even more beneficial for all the states because now we don't have to fight with each other, right? We can all operate according to the same rules, the same laws. We are going to recognize everyone else's laws and their people, and we're going to, and that's what created so much wealth in such a short amount of time in America. That's why we had such a big boom leading up to the Civil War and stuff, and even after the Civil War, we still had quite a few good things going. And that's why if you read the Army Training Manual from 1928 on American government and citizenship, there's a lot of really good information in there. And again, because this was right before the 30s when things went really off the rails. We already have chinks in the armor from the 14th Amendment and the manipulations of the American Bar Society being formed and all that in the late 1800s and 1900 area there. But when they got the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 and then declared that banking emergency in the 30s, things went sideways real quick. So we have to kind of take into account those time periods and what transpired so we can kind of understand what changed, how did it change, and how can we undo what was done? How can we, kind of backtrack and deconstruct it?
And I do have a couple of more questions, but I'm going to see if there are other questions coming up from the floor. Have you got anything, Chris?
I have a question.
Go ahead, John.
Are you, Patrick, considering the three different United States corporations in what you're considering there?
Oh, sorry, I was really quiet. Could you repeat that? Can you get any louder?
Pardon me? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
John, can you speak up?
Oh, is that... okay, I'll speak up a little bit louder. I can turn it up otherwise, but not very easily right now. When you talk about the United States as the central government, have you considered the three different United States corporations, as in the municipal United States Incorporated or the territorial United States Incorporated?
Yeah, there's only the United States as a government is only still a single entity. There might be other private corporations and something that get set up that are doing their own thing, but every government operates, like I was saying, in those two capacities. Part of what makes this a little tricky is the fact the United States operates in essentially two public capacities. And that's what you'll find in the Downsby Vidwell case, because he's saying that the Bar Association was making the argument that in our country we have two national governments. So this is where it gets a little tricky, because if you got two national governments and then plus they operate in their private capacity, this might be where you're seeing those three entities. Now, whether you're relating it to a territorial corporation or not, I'm not sure what the organization of that would be, but that might be the three entities you're seeing is the United States in relation to their own nation state and their own citizens, the United States in relation to their powers as a federal government to the Union of States, and then the United States still operating as a private corporation doing business, and getting involved in contracts and stuff like that.
Well, it appears that presently the territorial United States Incorporated is essentially controlling all of the states' governments. And correct me if I'm wrong on that. What do you think of that?
They're not necessarily controlling the states, they're controlling the people. So what happens when you become, so this has got a twofold effect when your status as an individual gets changed. So you can only have one domicile. If you claim a domicile in federal territory, that means the moment you leave federal territory and you go live in a state, you're now a legal alien. You're no longer a state citizen. So that state constitution no longer applies to you. And this is where a lot of people are seeing, administrative courts or maritime courts or admiralty courts, wherever they think's going on. It's not that. It's what they're missing is this personal law that's is a connecting factor with your legal jurisdiction. You're essentially in the administrative containment field of being a U.S. citizen, which, like I said, when you go back to the record, all civil rights are built upon property rights. If you lose the ability to own property, you really have no legal capacity at all. And this is where not that I really recommend a lot of Anna's material, because I think she's missed the page on a lot of stuff, but she's even said, hey, we're putting these affidavits in and they're not even listed, they're just ignoring them. That's because you have no legal capacity. You see, you're civilly dead. You don't have any legal capacity behind your actions anymore, because you changed your personal law from being a state citizen with unalienable rights to a U.S. citizen, which is a collectivist government which uses socialism, so all property resides in the state, not the individual. So when you lose that ability to own property, you just throw all your civil rights right out the window, right? And this is where you get just your privileges. and they get to decide what applies to you and what doesn't, and you lose all accountability. Well, from in relation to the government.
Is there any way that one can determine where they might have made mistakes in the past, and so that they can correct that?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's kind of what my aim is, and that's what I'm still trying to, essentially prove, or have the evidence to prove that beyond a shadow of doubt that it is all attached to that SS5 application. That's the original numinate record that gets attached to the individual right after they're born. Right after the birth certificate, they're pushing this SS5, and that is the only form that I've found in relation that an individual fills out that they choose their citizenship. Even when you fill out the passport application, it'll ask if your parents are U.S. citizens. It'll ask if you've married a U.S. citizen, but nowhere on that form does it ask you to claim that you're a U.S. citizen, right? Because that political allegiance is already created by wherever you're born. That happens by execution of law under public international law. That's not something you choose. It's assigned to you. Domicile and your civil status is something that you choose. A domicile of choice requires intent. And so this is my belief, again, that when you look at that SS5, they're asking for you to volunteer information. This is where they're claiming they're legally justified. Well, see, they volunteered it. This was their intent to claim, a U.S. domicile. Well, all while using words to mislead people, right? So that we essentially, are incriminating ourselves because we don't know what we're doing, and no one explained it, of course, because it's to their benefit. This is what gives them the ability to tax us, to regulate us, to permit us, all those things that follow, because you just lost all your constitutional protections.
Are you suggesting that you should not claim your domicile?
No, you should, but that's the problem then, is getting the system to acknowledge that we have a right to claim a domicile within the state. And so it's coming from the federal level, because they're in charge of interstate commerce. They're in charge of financial securities. These are part of their delegated powers under the Constitution. So they have a constitutional power to essentially set these systems up, but the way that they've implemented them, they of course have done it at the detriment of the people, which is a violation. So that's where it's getting back to, we're going to have to find a way to force the system to recognize that it is violating our fundamental law. We have a right as people. Every person has a right to claim a domicile within the state, within the nation of which they live, and that's what they're denying to us on that form. I don't know of any other way to do it other than through that form. That's why they made it. That's why I called it earlier, like they're the gatekeepers. You can't just do a declaration. You can't just send out paperwork and put somebody on notice. This has all been systemized for a reason. It's all for their control. So we're going to have to somehow go through the states or go through the federal government at a level to force them to correct these records, to take acknowledgement of what the errors that have been happening for a very long time now. And then this is going to be an uphill battle, because there's a lot of people that got skin in the game in this. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of crime that's going to come out, come to light when this stuff hits the light of day. So it's not going to be an easy thing to do.
Okay, are there other questions? Patrick, did you hear somebody got a question back there? Is that you, John?
Yeah, it was.
Go ahead.
Patrick, if you didn't have a birth certificate, wouldn't it be true that you couldn't fill out an SS5?
Yes and no, because you're still, even if you couldn't fill one out, you're going to be at a disability. A lot of the people, like I said, they try to invalidate the system, which is a route to go to help protect yourself, but it also puts you at a disadvantage, because now you can't interact commercially with a lot of these systems that we really, at this point in civilization, we are necessary, right? Unless you're going to live like Amish people, unless you want to go out and live in the woods, you don't want utilities, you don't want phone service. Like that's why these systems have been all intertwined, because it gives them a lot of control. So without a birth certificate, yeah, you don't get an SS5 or you don't get a Social Security number, but then you're forced to live outside the system. And
so you'd be an alien then, wouldn't you?
Yeah, yep. Because without having the birth certificate, you have to have the political status or the nationality of one of the nations within the Union or the United States in order to have a number. Right. So if you don't have that political status, if you don't have that birth certificate proving that you're part of that political body, if you've not been incorporated into it, then they're not going to issue the number.
Right. And then that political society wouldn't recognize you, right?
Correct. You would just be treated as a legal alien, and you would have a basic set of civil rights, but you're not going to get constitutional protections. And that's really what we're going after, because that's what gives the protection from government overreach and corruption.
Okay. I may go in a different direction with that, but I just wanted to at least point that out. Okay. I'll let somebody ask this question. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Other questions? I was going to ask if you had heard President Trump talking somewhere the other day, talking about how citizenship used to be a really great thing. People wanted to be a U.S. citizen, and now somebody known as they are trying to make it a shameful thing. And I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, and there's also been quotes from Trump talking about when they consider us all statutory U.S. citizens. And statutory, you're looking at the private international law side of it, at least from my interpretation. And that's when you're looking at these legal mechanisms that they're using to make these determinations. We also have the issue of voting, too. That was another one of his tweets that I don't know if it was ever verified or not. Talking about people when they participate in the popular vote for a president, they've just committed a crime against the Republican form of government. And whether he said it or not, from my understanding, that's a very true statement. If you look at, again, the way we're set up as a representative Republican form of government, we're supposed to be voting for our representatives in our state offices. That's about it. They do the Electoral College. The Electoral College chooses the president, and that's the chain of action, because we're not we're not a democracy. The United States is a democracy. So if you go and vote in a democracy, you've just essentially invalidated our Republican form of government. And that might be another aspect of things that a lot of people don't ever think about or realize either.
Right, and that is my understanding. In fact, the second paragraph, we've talked about this before. L.B. Bork's treatise on the 14th Amendment, the Red Amendment, and the second paragraph of that, legally characterizing statesmen, one of the citizens of the states that have as an enemy of their state.
Yeah, and they might be using that again as another behind the scenes legal justification for what they're doing. It's hard to say, but that is definitely another kind of mechanism to look at and try to understand. But since you bring up the 14th Amendment, there's another kind of part of that I can point out that a lot of people overlook, because the 14th Amendment was written in relation to the southern states not recognizing black people's legal rights. They weren't giving them, the ability to give testimony and evidence in a court of law, but they were giving it to white aliens, right? So a lot of the stuff didn't have to do with political rights. It had to do with civil rights, which is what the Civil War was all about. And then we're talking about civil status. So you start to see all these things kind of line up. And then when you read the 14th Amendment, it says that you can have dual citizenship, essentially. All persons born are subject to the jurisdiction thereof. This is I have a court case that talks about it. So when they say subject to the jurisdiction thereof, the courts have said they're not talking about subject to jurisdiction in some way or in some capacity, but completely subject to their jurisdiction. And the jurisdiction they're referring to was their political jurisdiction. So this is where you can see it. Someone who is a citizen of a state would not be completely subject to the political jurisdiction of the United States. They're subject to the political jurisdiction of the state they're living in. So that's where the 14th Amendment wouldn't even apply to someone that already had state citizenship. It was irrelevant to them. But you can also see that, so they say all persons born or naturalized in the United States, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So where they reside, that's another important concept, because now they're talking about domicile again. See, when you reside, when you have a domicile within the state, you are also a state citizen. And this is where you get your state constitutional protections. So you can see that they're recognizing that the supremacy of law domicile under private international law right in the 14th Amendment.
most of the people that I know that talk about status correction are talking about renouncing their citizenship, being a subject.
Yeah.
Jurisdiction of, basically. So they're doing that by making declarations. They're saying, no, this is what I am. My parents were born on this state. This is where I'm a national. And domicile is here. And so I call it a statesman, just somebody who belongs to one of the states. Do you have to really make the distinction between public and private international law?
At this point, I don't see how you wouldn't, because, like I said, this is essentially the frameworks, the underpinnings that apply to all nations throughout the world. Essentially, at this point, this is how they separate and administer the different legal jurisdictions. And the important part is, because of the way the United States is set up, we were already in line with this. A lot of these big changes with international law in the private side in domicile were really changes that European countries had to make, European nations. The European nations were using nationality as a determination of personal law and personal rights. And that was part of what was creating some of these problems when they started traveling all around, is because we had some countries using nationality, other people using domicile in different mechanisms, which was creating the problem. So once they determined that this was no longer going to be feasible to continue on this way as as civilization was expanding and growing, you had the 1868 I think it was an 1870 treaty with Britain, where Britain finally had to acknowledge the right of expatriation. Previous to that, Britain had maintained that if you were born as a British subject, you were going to be a British subject for your entire life. They stood upon like a perpetual political allegiance to the crown. With what was happening with the international travel and trade and the way the United States was operating, because we were coming on as a pretty big power at that point, we were saying, no, this is nonsense. And the right of expatriation in some of these treaties became a guaranteed right to all people. And previous to some of these treaties, that didn't exist. So that was one of those big changes that took place again that was for a great benefit to mankind. I mean, these were things that needed to be acknowledged and needed to be ironed out. So a lot of these legal systems, they're not necessarily set in stone. They're pliable, they're flexible, and they're still kind of changing and evolving as civilization and society moves along. That's why individual participation and individual study and research and being involved in this stuff is really important, because it's not like what we're doing now is going to be the same thing we're doing in 50 years. Just like what we're doing now was not what we were doing 100 years ago. So it's really just kind of in flux as society changes and moves, and we need to stay on top of it, because otherwise we lose grip of it. And that's essentially what happened in the 30s. Is people got comfortable. You had the Roaring '20s where everyone was economically sound. They had food, they had roof over their head. They pulled the rug out of everybody when they called in all the debts and forced the Great Depression on us, and that just was like a shock on the whole psyche of the country. And I don't think we ever fully recovered from that. And we're still trying to get our wits back from all the things that have transpired due to those events that took place.
So, Patrick, when people are doing that, as I was talking about, they're expatriating from citizenship, the 14th Amendment, and going back and saying that they're state nationals. That's old. You're saying that's old technology, basically. They say a lot of the times when people try to expatriate, they're not even actually expatriating, because it's really hard to lose your nationality. Usually the best thing to do if you're looking to change your nationality is to move and naturalize into another country, because then that would automatically replace the pre-existing status. But to try to sever your political ties is a very difficult thing to do right now. And then on top of that, most of your personal rights, your private rights, aren't even based on your political status. And that's what this research, why this stuff is important to understand, because the legal mechanism they're using is where you're domiciled anyways. If you sever your political ties to the nationality of the United States of America, right, then you can't claim a legal domicile. You're not going to get any constitutional protections. You've essentially just isolated yourself to being a legal alien. Okay, that's not that was not. They're not expatriating from the United States of America, and they're not changing their nationality. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Debbie. We're right in the middle of a conversation about status and standing, and I'm just asking a question about changing your status. Okay, so I think maybe you misunderstood. I'm talking about under the 14th Amendment, we all became dual citizens, a citizen of the Arctic and a citizen of the United States in Washington, D.C. Okay, so we became subject to the jurisdiction of the United States government.
No, that's what I'm saying. That's not how the 14th Amendment worked. The people that already had state citizenship it didn't affect them at all. The 14th Amendment only went to people that had no citizenship, and it was extended for the people, most notably the black people in the South, who were being oppressed by the state government. That's why they wrote that legislation, was to give them some sort of legal capacity for civil rights, right? Not political rights, because the political rights have to come from the nation. The United States can't grant political rights to somebody that's living in a state that's outside their jurisdiction. So that's
are you saying that taxpayers are not citizens of the United States? When did everybody presumptively become a citizen of the United States?
That was the SS5. Are you familiar with what was the 1930s? Because that's when they forced the SS5 onto people. So, well, if you want to get a job, you have to file an SS5. Okay,
so what I'm saying is, if people are self-declaring and saying, because the Expatriation Act of 1868 happened just the day before the ratification, it was deemed to be ratified, the 14th Amendment, and we had the right to expatriate from that time on. And so what I'm saying is, when people declare their status as no longer citizens of the United States, Washington, and they're saying, I'm just claiming my state nationality.
Right, but that's part of what you're not seeing is just that's what I was trying to explain. When you're talking about nationality and political jurisdiction, when you say United States in that context, you're not talking about Washington, D.C. When you're under political and nationality, the United States is all the states of the Union, and D.C., it's everything. That's why in the passports it says United States of America. United States of America is a country that has multiple nationalities within it, right? So in that public layer, it is a single entity. So that's what I'm saying. But if you try to expatriate politically from the Union, because the United States in political and public law is the Union. It's the Union, and D.C. It's everything. It's Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands, right? Those are all parts of all the territories of the United States of America.
Okay, so the definition of United States under public international law is the Union.
Correct. It's not even just Union. It's everything that comprises, and that's why if you go to Title 8, kind of describes that, because I think they list off the continental states of the Union, Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, Guam. Like they list off the other 5 territories of the United States, because the territories of the United States are also part of the Dominion of the United States of America, right? The whole enchilada, essentially. It's everything.
So when we're correcting our status and we're basically saying, and I'll stop asking questions in a second here, but when we're basically saying, we're clarifying, and you know about Riem versus United States, there's only one way to become a citizen of the United States in the private international law sense, Washington, and that's to find a representative and raise your right hand and go through a particular type of rigmarole, and then you become a citizen of the United States. Are you familiar with that one, REUM? R-E-U-M?
I would have to. I'm not personally familiar with that, no.
Okay, it's just what this case said is there's only one way to become a citizen of the United States. So my point is that when we are trying to write a declaration to clarify some of these things, we never intended to be a citizen of Washington. We aren't a citizen of Washington now. There's only one way to become that. So you're saying, what I'm hearing you say is you have to understand the distinction between private international law and public international law in order to in order to make it clear what citizenship.
What entity and what citizenship you're talking about. Because as I said, in either body of law, the words typically, there are a few, I mean, some of the words are all the same, right? But there are a few key words that have different meanings. United States obviously being one of them, citizenship being another one, that they mean different things based on what layer you're talking about. And that's why you have to know kind of, it's there's a Hooven case too that talks about, the different definitions of the United States. And there's 3 different definitions that the court gives about the United States. So if we know that there's 3 definitions for what the United States is, then you have to automatically say, well, what is a U.S. citizen then? Well, there must be at least 3 different definitions of a U.S. citizen. If the term United States has multiple definitions, then U.S. citizen is more than one thing. And so then you have to know what layer and what capacity you're talking about, because otherwise, since you're not going to be able to properly communicate with the system to get the outcome that we're looking to get.
Okay, it's my perspective that I write my declarations, and I'm the one who gets to explain them, and I'm not really looking for much acknowledgement from the system. I'm just, this is what it is, and I'm the one who gets to tell you what it means. But, I mean, I hear what you're saying as well.
Right. Well, a lot of people try to go that route, but that's not the way our governments are even set up to operate. We have the constitutions with these limitations and these powers granted for a reason. They organize the governments to uphold, to protect their citizens and to protect property. So, like I said, a lot of things went sideways in the 30s, but essentially you have to remember that the fundamental principle of any government is to protect its people and their property. So they have an obligation, and they have a political, and they have the sovereignty, right, the powers granted to them from the people that organize them, right, that ratify these constitutions. So they're not acting in just some arbitrary manner. I mean, that's the reason they have those fundamental documents. That's what gave them life. It's essentially a charter of creation. So they have an obligation, even again with being created and given those powers, that they have to uphold the law, they have to uphold property rights, and they have to do certain things. So that's where the responsibility for us to understand how these things were set up and how they operate. Again, that's on us. To be self-governing, to consider yourself a sovereign, you're 100% responsible. And again, the education and the knowledge of these things it ultimately ends with you, the individual. So that's why they've infiltrated, and that's why we see so much corruption with the media, with the schooling, with all, because they're trying to making sure they're just making us dumb, retarded animals. They don't want us to understand these things, because if we do, I mean, again, the truth and the fundamental law is on our side, 100%. It's there for us to have access to stop the very things that we're fighting right now.
So you're saying that the only possible way to correct your civil status, which is where most of your rights come from, is like correcting on the SS5 your citizenship, and you think that the correct citizenship status is legal alien allowed to work? Correct.
That's from my research and my opinion. Other people can kind of take that for what it's worth, but from everything that I've seen, that's the only thing that fills in the blank spots of why things happen the way they do. It explains how Congress passes so many regulations in relation to interstate commerce, right? Because if you have a domicile in D.C. and you live in a state, everything you do is interstate commerce. A lot of their gun regulations are built upon their powers of interstate commerce. So when you start to see the mechanisms of what they're relying on to pass this legislation, again, it starts to give you hints and clues as to what's happening. What mechanism is happening here that would explain how this is happening without it being, blatantly criminal, without it being, prima facie evidence of treason and fraud, right? There has to be some sort of legal mechanism they're relying on, or a legal theory, legal justification for how they're able to do what they do. Because the people that are in these positions of power are not dumb. They're intelligent people. They're just evil.
May I ask a question, please? What about like on the voter registration or the driver's license application, where it says, "Are you a resident of the U.S.?" You know how many times I've checked that, and I should not have checked that. And I'll tell you, one of the things, sir, is that you say there has to be a legal way. There is no legal way. There is nothing. It's vacant. So anyway, I don't know about
what
about
do you mean it's vacant?
What is a resident to you then?
Well, resident means it can
I'll
mean
stand down.
yeah, a resident can mean multiple different things. I mean, as I said, it depends on if you're talking about a resident through public international law, which is dealing with nationality, like a foreign national. But resident typically has to do with your domicile. It has to do with where you're living. Are you within a territorial jurisdiction of a certain entity? You know, and that's why the courts even now today, when they pull you in, they're asking for your residence, right? What's your address?
But I'm not a resident.
Right. But you are, because you reside somewhere. You're in somebody's jurisdiction, and so this the only thing that separates
has nothing to do with being an American. It has to do with being in the United States Inc., and that's how they got us in, I believe.
Well, if that's your opinion, I have my opinion and my research.
I'm a student, but thank you.
Okay. You understand, the governments are set up and they have territorial jurisdiction. If you're located within the territory, then they have subject matter jurisdiction. They have personal jurisdiction. The only thing that's left to question is what protections do you have against that government? Are you a legal alien? Are you a resident alien? Are you a citizen? Right? A citizen is entitled to the constitutional protections. A legal alien living there is not entitled to the constitutional protections. And so there are legal mechanisms operating here underpinning this stuff that explain why these things are happening and why the courts are able to do what they do, why the state government can operate with impunity, why there's no oversight anymore. There's an explanation to these things. A lot of people just haven't really dug deep enough or read the right material to really see what's happening. I don't say all this to try to justify. I don't say all this to try to justify what's happened. I mean, we're dealing with a lot of bad things right now. But just my position is to operate within the systems of the law, because the law was there to provide justice, right? And I believe that it can still do that thing, because it is just a tool, and it's the operators, it's us, it's the creative element of the human hand that can steer it, that can use that tool. It can be used for good or it can be used for bad. It's just a tool.
Well, I do not agree, because the law is actually written by a higher power, and that is actually as powerful as the law of gravity, but we haven't picked it up in a long time, and that's part of why. And so, I really appreciate your views.
Well, yeah, what you're talking about, God's law is natural law. If you go to the Declaration of Independence, right, it's all men are created equal. We find this to be self-evident. Self-evident is talking about, again, human nature, what it is to be man, and the right to own property, the right to life. These were unalienable rights that the founders of our country recognized. That's what we're trying to get back to. That's where I'm trying to use the law to get back into, to have at our back, to have as a defense, right? Because we're supposed to be guaranteed. This is our fundamental structure of government here.
Could we go back to the driver's license question, please?
Oh, go ahead. What's the question?
Okay. The last time I got mine renewed, I intentionally left that U.S. citizen box blank just to see if I could get away with it. And the lady finished that for me, and I said to her, I left that blank for a reason. I did not want to check that box. And she said, oh, we have to check that box. And that box is connected to their emoluments, the money that they get from the corporation. And that's about as far as I got. But I tried not to even check it. But the lady finished my form for me, and that's fraud and trickery. But that's what happened when I tried to not just leave the blank, leave it open, leave it blank. It didn't work. But it's connected to money.
Yeah, I would agree more or less, but that's where it comes back to that Newman record, the SS5. And the reason I check off U.S. citizen is because your SS5 is recorded as a U.S. citizen. And that all has to do with the interstate commerce, right?
They check it off because they can, because they're bullying. They should not have checked that. She's not an idiot. The lady did what she wanted, and they changed it.
Right.
And that's wrong.
that intentionally to see if they were going to do that, and I called it to her attention, and she just went on her business, but it's attached to the money.
Interesting.
Hey, Patrick, you mentioned a Facebook group that you gave a talk on. What's that group?
I would recommend anyone. I typically post stuff up there, and there's a lot of good information in the file section. It's called Internally Displaced.
Oh, okay. Is that like Jackie Fig?
That's Jackie Fig. Yes, it is.
Okay.
I've been doing more on that site as of recently, and that's when, just last night I did a talk on there with Jackie and Salam, who was hosting it. But yeah, go check that out. I think she posted. I also, was writing a kind of a 3-part blog piece that she's posting as well that you can kind of go read to get. I'm trying to summarize this and try to simplify it so it's easier for people to kind of follow along, because there are a few moving pieces of stuff, and when you're new to the material or you've not really read some of this, it can seem like reading a foreign language at times. It took me years just to build up, the knowledge base essentially to understand some of the legal concepts and terms that are being used. And that's the reason they don't teach us this stuff in school, right? I mean, essentially, we don't have much of a chance. We don't have knowledge of what's happening.
Are there people that are getting anywhere on correcting their civil status as of now?
No, as far as I know, this is still pretty new to everyone that I talk to. No one has really forged this path, to its final end to get an outcome that we need to test the theory, to test it out and make sure that this is the mechanism they're relying on. This is how they're getting the jurisdiction. Like I said, it's kind of one of those things right now where you can see all the elements behind it, kind of like, you can't see the wind, but you can see the tree move, right? So we're having to use deductive logic to be like, well, if this moves that and that moves that, that moves that, then that must mean that this is what's causing it, right? It's just kind of like a process of elimination. But until we've actually get a record corrected or get some sort of verified information from a state government, from a court, from the executive office, of the United States or something, where I'm going to try sending out more paperwork here within the next week or two to try to get some more answers to vet this thing out.
Okay, and I just had one question, too, about just about what jurisdiction you're in when you're working within the system. Isn't that commercial?
It can be commercial. It depends on what you're doing. I mean, a lot of what they're relying is the commercial aspect of it, yeah.
Okay, and if you're one of the people of the states and you rely on your antecedent God-given rights, the rights from time immemorial, okay, and you're operating under the supreme law of the land or the law of the land on the land jurisdiction.
Right, which the supreme law of the land is the Constitution.
Supreme law of the land is the Constitution. The Constitution is, it says that the people of the states, they're under common law.
Yes, correct.
So if you claim the land jurisdiction and don't operate in the commercial jurisdiction, those. Tell me where I'm not getting.
No, you're right. So that's the mechanism. Yeah, that's the mechanism I'm trying to explain. So like interstate commerce is something that Congress can regulate, and this is why that civil status, that legal domicile, is so important, because that legal domicile is going to determine when you're involved in interstate commerce or when you're involved in domestic, local, like state trade, like what you're talking about, right, where it's within the nation. So if you have a legal domicile that's outside of where you're living, then you're involved in interstate trade.
So you're saying if your domicile is United States.
If your legal domicile is corrected to be in unison with your nationality or the place you're living, right, within, so let's say you're Alaska, and your status is corrected to be, an Alaska citizen now because you have a permanent residence there, and your SS5 is claiming legal alien, which means you're outside of U.S. territorial jurisdiction, you would be entitled to constitutional protections. You would not be involved in interstate commerce, You would be involved in your domestic trade within your state, right? Kind of like how Amish people are able to operate. And you'll notice, again, this is one of the signs of what's happening. Amish people are usually more or less left to their own, right? They can participate in their local communities and use money and everything and not really have any problems. Now, when they get involved in going across state boundaries, there was that famous, pretty popular case, or well-known, at least that came to my attention, was the Samuel A. Girard that was selling his homemade salves. And it wasn't until he started crossing state boundaries that the FDA came in and prosecuted him and he went to jail. Because once he crossed the state boundary, he was now in federal jurisdiction. That was interstate trade. And I've seen similar things with Amish people who were selling raw milk across state boundaries. So you cross the state boundary, and now you're involved in interstate trade, the federal jurisdiction kicks in, and now you got all kinds of problems. Because you don't have constitutional protection.
If we could take this one step at a time, okay? Everybody who is born in one of the states is presumed to be a citizen of the United States under private international law, civilly. They're civilly presumed to be.
Publicly, on nationality, they would be a United States citizen.
What about privately?
Privately, you're born in one of the states of the Union. You have assigned to you a domicile of origin. So when you're first born, your domicile of origin, which would be, kind of an extension of wherever your parents live, right? Because the child's the property of the parents. The domicile of origin would be of the state. The domicile of origin is only replaced when a domicile of choice is elected. This is why they give you the SS5. The SS5 operates as a domicile of choice. When you claim U.S. citizen, you've just removed your state domicile, right? Your legal alien status in relation to the United States.
Okay, are you saying this is under, SS5, you've elected to be citizen of the United States, so everything that you do in your life is regulated as interstate commerce?
Yes, and it's not even that it's just interstate commerce, because you're a U.S. citizen, you're under the exclusive jurisdiction of the United States, right? This is how they're able to write all the regulations.
Of the Congress. Yeah, plenary oligarchy. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay,
yep.
so
whereas even if you had a legal domicile and say you had a domicile in California, but you were living in Alaska, well, you still have constitutional protections because you're still domiciled on a state of the union, not on federal territory.
Okay, and so you're saying the only way to correct this is if your nationality is as it was when you were born to parents that were born out in a state.
Correct.
And then your SS5 reflects the fact that you're a legal alien, meaning alien foreign to basically the District of Columbia, even if that's not technically.
Right. Well, it would be when you're saying, again, because you're going private, so the territory which the United States has, the jurisdiction over which the United States has is just D.C. and the federal enclaves, Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands, and that's when you get a Title 8 and you see some of them are like U.S. nationals, not U.S. citizens. There's some other nuances there, but for the majority of it, you're correct in that legal alien is just claiming that, hey, I'm foreign to the territorial jurisdiction of the United States.
What happens if you just rescind your? Okay, you're talking. If somebody were to rescind their signature on the SS5 from the beginning.
Yeah,
you were saying that's not a good idea because then you wouldn't be able to work in the system.
You can't interface. I mean, you can find ways around it. There's always ways around it, but it's going to be difficult, right? And that's why, I mean, even Jackie, she had a guest on that was an Amish guy, right, and talked about some of the obstacles that they have to try to overcome because they don't have Social Security numbers. So they can't get utilities, they can't get loans, they can't, there's limitations on how they can interact with civilization. So it's a really tough path to go. I mean, not that you can't do it, but it's going to be difficult.
But that would be a way to correct it without getting acknowledgement from them that if they would allow it to happen, because you've already have an established record, and so again, it's going to be really hard for them to just essentially dissolve that account, because what happens is that, from my understanding, again, that's a securities account.
So all the contracts you get involved in your lifetime that are involved with your Social Security number all go into these investment contracts. They get put out into the economic markets, on Wall Street and stuff like that. And you get interest and returns on some of this stuff, and that all the money that's attached to your Social Security number goes into that account. So it's not just a matter of making the record go away, right? You're going to have funds and stuff in that account, and so there's a whole process that would have to be gone through as far as what to do with that now. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Almost like a probate situation of like, oh, we have all this property, we have all these funds in here. What are we going to do with them? And if you don't correct your status, all that stuff resorts back to the United States. But if you correct your status, well, now it's private property. The United States doesn't have a right to it. So that's why they're going to fight this so hard, because that's a main source. I mean, that's how they're doing everything they're doing.
So they're not, Social Security Administration is not allowing you to correct your status. You did take this to court?
Yeah, yep. In which the court, the local district court, just dismissed it based on they considered it frivolous and incomprehensible. And it's complicated.
Well,
I mean, you can see
it kind of is. It kind of is. Yeah. I got to tell you. I mean, you did a great job, and it's not your fault. But I just kind of wonder, is this really going to be accessible to the common man? Is everybody able to understand this well enough to implement it? And it seems to me that's going to be a hard sell. It, we like our common law because it's common.
Right.
Common
this is the only way to get back to the common law is by addressing this. Right. This is how you change, because the domicile is a connecting factor to a legal jurisdiction. It's what determines your personal law. So when you correct this status, this is how you now get your common law back.
Well, isn't it all a big made up? Isn't it all a big made up world? And we live in anyway. Okay, I'm gonna let somebody else talk. Other questions from the floor.
I have a question. Am I on?
Go ahead.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. It's my understanding, and I'm still learning, but this United States Inc. is only run by the legislature. It is not run by Congress, or it's not. It's only run by the legislature. So that would be Congress, I guess. Then, but it has. I guess it's like in a vacuum like that, and they actually determine everything. There's no executive or judicial in there at all. Is that your understanding?
To an extent, I would think I would agree with that. I just don't know about the U.S. Inc. part of it. I would look at it more as the nation of the United States. That was, again, like it's its own city-state, its own nation-state, distinct from the union and the federal government. It's kind of like a nation within a nation type thing, which is what the layers is what makes it difficult to grasp. But yes, if you look at the Constitution, the legislature, the Congress was given, again, all rule-making powers over the territory of, the United States. So that's where that would come in, and I would say that you're, maybe just whatever United States Inc. is to you, but yeah, the legislature was given full power over that.
Patrick, you just brought up those graphs. We were going through those graphs. Where did we find those? Those were amazing. I think it was on CEDM. Yeah,
the citizenship diagrams from SEDM were really, like I said, it takes a while to get your mind wrapped around how this is laid out, because it's a purely like metaphysical, right? It's a very abstract thought concept. I had to read that citizenship diagram probably, 5 or 6 times over, a 3 or 4 month period before it finally started to click into place, and I actually was comprehending the different jurisdictions, the different capacities that exist within our government. And I don't know that it's that complicated, other than the fact that it's just completely foreign to anything that we know or we're taught. So it's the process of reprogramming that seems to be really difficult. But I think that's a really good document, and it has the imagery to really, the graphs to help.
Yeah. It is confusing. It's called. What was that?
Who authored that document? How can I get it?
Just go to SEDM, SEDM.org, and it's called the citizenship diagram, and it's you can print out. It's a bunch of color pages, like maybe 10 or 15 color pages.
All right.
Shows where all the different lines are drawn. So.
It's bien dado. Got it.
And any other questions? I know it's getting kind of late for you. It's probably about 12:30. Yeah. Yep. So we can let you go sometime soon. Let's let the last few questions come in now.
I just want to thank you for your time, sir, tonight. I appreciate it.
I appreciate your appreciation. It's a hard thing to sell to people, and it's not easy to try to walk through, because I mean it's taken myself a great deal of time to make sense of any of it. So you're welcome, and I appreciate it.
Could I ask you two quick questions? One, has there been a form prepared for correcting one's status as you comprehend it? That's one.
No, my understanding the form is the SS5. That's they actually have directions right through Social Security on how to update your record, and that's what I followed to a T, and they still denied to process the form. But yes, that's where I think that's where you have to get into the courts or the legislatures and get them involved to force the correction, because they're not going to do it voluntarily.
I also would like to know, is there a website you talk about the citizenship diagram? Where is that located?
Yeah, that's sedm.org.
What is it? .org? I missed that.
It's S as in Sam, E, D, M.
Somehow I'm missing that. If you could say it again clearly.
Hey, John.
Yeah, go ahead.
John,
you say it if you can.
I'll send it out to everybody. I'll send the citizenship diagram as an attachment and a link.
Okay, thank you. My final question is, how do you interpret the preamble to the federal Constitution?
Interpret it? How do I interpret it in which way?
Well, some people, including myself, has tended to interpret it as we, the people, being the sovereigns of the United States of America and of the state of their domicile.
Yeah, more or less the we, the people of the United States, and yeah, that's the people is a proper pronoun there. So they're referring to a particular class of people, which would be the state citizens. And I think if you go back to the beginning, to get representation or to have a political right to vote early on, land ownership was required. And I think that was partly wise, because they're very early on using that concept of domicile, right? You're a part of the permanent community. And by being a part of the permanent community, for the foreseeable future, you have a right to representation. And I think that's why we see the concept of domicile being used so heavily in our, in the very beginning of our country. There's even writings from Joseph Story talking about this stuff in commentaries of the Constitution, when somebody's citizenship changes. And he makes it very clear that when someone moves their place of home, right, when you move from one state to another and with the intent to make it permanent, your citizenship would change automatically as soon as that intent was expressed, right? As soon as you did something, you bought a house, you bought land, that showed an intent to make it permanent, and your citizenship at that moment would change. So what we see is the principles are still the same. It's just that they've changed the methods. With the creation of private international with the 1860s, and then the change in the currency in the 1930s, where they started, to make people, use systemized forms, right? They wanted to organize it all, and part of it was for good cause, because there was a lot more people and a lot more laws and a lot more, business and everything was moving. It gets hard to administer all these things. So there was good reason to it to an extent, but they manipulated it. The certain people within it, and then now we're working to correct that.
Did you say that when you are born into a particular state, you are a citizen of that state, but when you become domiciled permanently in a different state, you now become a citizen of that state?
That was the way it was done in the past, yes. My only point of bringing it up was that it's the same principle today. They're just using forms and a registration instead of using like the physical presence. So right now, you could move to whatever state you want, but it's not going to change your record. You have to file a form to update your record to reflect any change in the real world. That's the only thing that they've separated the concept from, physical reality. So we have to update the records. We have to understand the records first so that we know what's happening. And then we can make sure that the record reflects the reality, and that's where we're at right now. And a lot of that's going to have to do with re-educating people, because most people don't even realize that the states are sovereign, independent entities. Most people don't realize that state citizenship is even a thing anymore. I mean, we've all been indoctrinated. A lot of people in the system of law and the legal profession are clueless to a lot of this stuff. They went to the public educations just like the rest of us, and they have no idea what they're doing. They're just pushing paper. So that's the problem.
Patrick, did you actually get a copy of your SS5, I guess it is, form?
Yeah, my original.
How did you do that? Because I've been trying to do that for months, and I even contacted FOIA, and it kind of fell off the edge of the earth. I don't know. I
got a template. If I don't know if you can reach with Maria, I can email the template that I used. You use it through a FOIA, and there's just certain information you have to be on there, and you can fill it in, and it's just kind of an open form that you can put in information and mail it out.
That would be so cool. Would you please do that? Thank you.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, I guess it's going to take me about at least another week to understand what you've said, and we'll go back. We'll stick this up on. If
anyone's interested in this, get on Internally Displaced on Facebook there, because there's a lot of good information there. I post content there, and then that way, if you have any questions or want to ask me anything, I'm usually on there, so it's a good place to interface. Just try to figure some of the stuff out.
That's great. I did get an email from Jackie recently, too, and so I've been meaning to connect with her. So, yeah, and I encourage everybody to do that. And then if you can put me on any distribution list, then I'll forward it out to people, too, if you think of it.
Yep, that sounds good.
All right. Thanks so much for being here, and love hearing from you, and stay in touch, Patrick.
Yep, we'll do. We'll keep at it, and we'll keep you up to date on whatever else I can find out and any new info I come across.
All right. Thanks much. Good night.
Yep.
Thank you, Patrick. Is the call over now? Okay.